kind of an extra video, but I did want to explain one quick thing. Like with content that I get from the language stuff that I do on here, I did want to say something. Native English speakers tend to be of the opinion that Latin is where English comes from. It's not. I just want to make that very clear. We use Latin letters. The language itself is not from Latin. Languages that are languages like French and Spanish and Italian and Romanian. And there are also obscure ones, like Romansh in Switzerland. English comes from Germanic languages. We are directly related to German and Dutch and Afrikaans and Frisian. Similarly related languages are the Northern Germanic ones, which are like Norwegian and Swedish. And you also have Eastern Germanic languages, like Gothic, but they don't exist anymore. At least not spoken. So in the last video, I said that English was a Germanic language and not a Romance or Latin-based language. How in the world can you tell the difference? So Germanic and Romance languages are part of the overarching family, which is Indo-European. That does mean that they share a lot of characteristics. But Germanic languages are known particularly for their use of things called modals. Modals are things that look like verbs but don't behave like verbs. Examples are must, can, should, will. For example, if will is a verb, that means to want to. If it's used as a modal, it has a future meaning. English does not technically have a future tense, but Romance languages do have future tense. Instead of modals, they have conjugations that they use at the end of the verb. So you can have pure future forms of the verb. And there's other stuff too, but those are the two major defining factors. Not to mention how nouns work and all of that stuff, but that's a big one. Why am I doing this? I guess it's because I'm a nerd. And you get to enjoy every bit of it. This has nothing to do with the Worldwide Church of God cult, so feel free to move along if you don't want this. But this is one of my passions. And I feel like sharing it on the interwebs because I don't know of a very shortened form of this history. I'll try to make it 7 parts in total, and I'm not going to do it all at once, at least I don't think so. But here we go! The language we call English today began sometime around the year 500. There is a lot of debate on how to calculate when it began, but sometime around like 450, 500. The reason is because of invasions of the Jutes and Saxons back from the German area of Europe. Which means the earliest form of English is basically identical in grammar to modern-day German. Grammatically speaking, essentially identical. I ended off by saying that English grammar, when it first began, was essentially identical to modern-day German, but we definitely know that that's not the case today, because a lot has happened in 1500 years. We took a little teeny weeny little tiny bit of grammar and verb structure from Celtic languages, essentially having to do with our present and past tense concept of do verbs as well as some form of the progressive system. I am going to the store, for example. I did do my homework every day when I was a kid. Other than that, it pretty much stayed Western Germanic. This here is a perfect example with a lot of things like dative case nouns. Over time, prepositions like to would be used instead of this ending here. And this was pushed even further with the Viking invasions because Northern Germanic languages did the same thing. When the Vikings invaded, they did influence English grammar structure slightly. See, the Northern Germanic languages and the Western Germanic languages were very, very, very similar. English actually took some things on, like prepositions such as they, them, their. Have since no longer used the original versions, and that's been the case for over a millennium. And their noun endings were much more simplified than the original Old English ones. Instead, Northern Germanic languages used many more prepositions, and so we took that on. And the word order was slightly altered, with secondary verbs no longer moving to the end, but staying toward the beginning. So we don't say, I have for a long time English spoken. Rather, we say, I have spoken English for a long time. And this change wasn't universal. The dialects of English had many alterations between them. Something would soon start to bring them together. The French, or Normans. Okay, so I guess I am going to do all this all at once, so yay. So when the Norman French invaded in 1066, this officially begins the stage of the English language called Middle English. It doesn't mean that the language changed overnight, but it was this invasion that began the massive influx of French words. Actually, it's not really French. It's an older version of the language that people call Old French, but it's not technically Old French. French today is 90% Norman. So it's basically Old French, but there is a nuance. But with the royalty refusing to speak English for a few hundred years until Queen Elizabeth I, English took on words to accommodate the new royal vocabulary. Everything was touched, like law and education and food. And endings like ment and tion entered English. And English never looked the same again. After the influx of so many, basically French words, English began to have something akin to a double vocabulary, with more formal terms, typically from French. I'm just saying French to make it easier. It's essentially Old French. So we had light, which is Germanic, and lumination, which is Norman. Same thing, nuance in terms of formality. And then we started to use Germanic suffixes on Norman words, like seriously, seriousness, person, hood. So English still remained Germanic, just with a lot of foreign vocabulary. During this stage of the language, you have characters like Chaucer. Notice that this is a lot more recognizable than this. It was also during this time that something huge started to happen, called the Great Vowel Shift. It changed the language so much that words like du became thou, and became and, mak, make. Queen Elizabeth I was the very first monarch since the Norman invasion to promote English as the national language. It was also contemporary with Shakespeare, and the King James Version of the Bible was formed around the same time. Here's the first edition of a Shakespearean collection, and you can see that there's still a lot of differences. But the language had officially entered the modern English stage. But because it looks strange like this, it's called early modern English. And there were some grammar points in early modern English that we don't use today, like with thou and how to conjugate and various things like that. And real quick pet peeve comment, thou and you are completely separate. So if you actually see them used to the same person in the same sentence, thou was singular, you was plural, and sometimes thou was informal. Not formal! So that's funny how it switched today, because thou is perceived as formal today. And you could also be ye in subject form. This should be the last video, but I might also do some sound clips of what the versions of English sounded like at various points. And I might do a quick video on lettering. But after early modern English began, the Enlightenment was on the horizon, and because of that, a lot of scientific terms came in and were based on Latin and Greek roots. So a lot of Latin terms came in through the church and the Norman invasion, but now the Enlightenment made it so that way science was Latin-based as well. And Greek-based. It's about half and half. And the words we use typically have the same English morphology. The only time it doesn't is like with plural forms of Latin nouns and stuff like that. We did not take on Latin or Greek grammar, although there was an attempt to do so. This is the reason why you're told by your teachers not to put adverbs at the end of sentences, because it mimics Latin grammar. Don't end a sentence in a preposition was also from that. That was not an original rule. And with that, over time, we speak it today. Addendum 1 of 2. In terms of lettering, English originally started with these. It is an alphabet, and the English version is called Futhorc. Most people call them runes, but runes have more of a magical association with them rather than the lettering itself. Granted, these were often found on incantations. Futhorc, however, was very difficult to pen, and for that reason, Latin letters pushed Futhorc out of wide use. English retained 2 letters from Futhorc. One of them was thorn, pronounced either th or th. The second was win, pronounced like a W. But change was still happening. That D-looking thing and this letter were exactly the same. And this was the beginning of the letter G. It was pronounced closer to a Y. And U was used for V in the middle of words. And when typesetting came along, this letter became a Y. So it looks like ye old shop, but it's the old shop. Final part, I swear. So real quick thing, 2 things on lettering. This was thou.
It was just a shortened form of that. So if you ever read that in an original text, that's what it means. And S did the same thing that it did in every European language. There were two forms of S. One used at the beginning and middle, one used at the end. This is where you get letters like SZ from German. SZ. SZ. But today, it's basically a double S, and you can see the shape is about the same. You'll see shapes like this in the Declaration of Independence. Now for some clips.
Hoe lange bear ich mit eeuw? Hoe lange forbear ich eeuw? Bringeth hinne to me hider. A man came to him, folded on knees before him, saying, Lord, have mercy on me sonne. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him here to me.
Cool.